What's up YouTube, I'm Guy, and today on the channel we're talking Seiko watches. We're talking Seiko dive watches, and specifically we're talking the Seiko Samurai SRPB49. So Seiko is more or less the king of dive watches at the sub $500 price point in the entry level. I don't think that there's anybody that would argue that point. There are some other good options out there, but when you talk about volume, you have the Seiko Skx, the Seiko Turtle, the Seiko Sumo, the Samurai, there's the Seiko 5 Sea Urchin, and then a whole host of other solar quartz divers in the Seiko catalog below the $500 price point. I really don't think anyone else comes close. It's really the brand when it comes to entry-level divers. And today we're checking out the Seiko Samurai. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set it next to some of those other divers that I just mentioned and do a little bit of a comparison, but mostly this is going to be a review of the Samurai. I'm going to give you my impressions about the watch. I'm going to show it to you guys. I'm going to share it with you. This watch was sent to me on loan by a viewer. I have to send a big, gracious thank you to him. I really do appreciate that. I really do appreciate it when all of you guys reach out to me and ask me about loaning me watches for review. It does mean the world to me. Before we hop over to the tabletop, I did want to remind you that I'm going to be hosting a giveaway here probably in the next week or so. I mentioned it in my last video. To be eligible for that giveaway, you have to be a member of the Facebook group Horology 101. I'll put a link to that group down in the description of this video, but yeah, keep an eye out for it. I'm just kind of teasing it right now. I'm not going to tell you what those watches are, but it's going to be 2 watches I'm giving to one viewer, a dive watch and a dress watch. They're entry-level watches. Don't get your hopes way too high, but I think they're cool watches. I'm going to go ahead and do a full review of those 2 watches when I announce the giveaway, probably later next week. So keep an eye out for that, and in the meantime, go over to Facebook and join that group, Horology 101. I think you'll want to get in there soon and be eligible for this giveaway. I'm going to pop over to the tabletop view. We're going to take a look at this Seiko Samurai, and again, I'll compare it to a few other Seikos that I have here, and, you know, go over the specifications, the features, do a typical review with a little bit of comparison. Again, not going to be a full-on versus video like I did in the past. I don't know if you saw it, but if you haven't, go back into my library. I did a really cool video comparing the SKX to the Turtle to the Sumo. I had all 3 of those and did a really detailed comparison of those 3 watches. I'm not going to get that in-depth, but I will show you some of the other more common Seiko dive watches next to this Samurai, and again, give you my impressions. So, we'll be right back. Alright guys, here we have the Seiko Samurai SRPB49 This is the J version, the made in Japan version. There's also a K version, though I don't find, in my experience with other J versus K models from Seiko, that there's much of a difference. So we won't harp on that too much. First things first, MSRP on this watch, $525. And while this particular model, the SRPB49, seems to be a little bit harder to find as I was looking around online, most of the Samurai models can be found for just under $400, maybe $350. I suspect if you look around, you will be able to find this in that price range as well. I'll continue to look, and I'll put links down to Amazon through my affiliate link in the description below for this model and some of the other ones if you're curious to find some. First thing I usually cover when my reviews is the dimensions of the watch. This watch, the case dimensions, are 44 millimeters in diameter from one side of the case to the other, not including the crown or crown guards. A lug width where the bracelet attaches of 22 millimeters and a thickness that comes in at 13.5. The lug-to-lug width from one extremity of the case to the other, or the watch's wingspan, which is what I like to call it, is 48 millimeters, which is fairly short for a dive watch. It does make this watch feel a bit smaller than the 44 millimeter case diameter might suggest. So, if you feel like 44 millimeters is too big for you, don't worry. This probably will work. This wears a bit more like a 43 or 42 even, if I had to give my opinion on it. This watch runs the 4R35 movement. We'll talk about that briefly first. It's a 23 joule automatic hand winding and hacking movement with 41-hour power reserve. It does run at a 21,600 vibrations per hour, and stated accuracy in the manual on this is from minus 35 seconds per day to plus 45 seconds per day. So out of the box, while you're probably going to get much better accuracy than that, keep in mind that it could be more than half a minute fast or slow in one direction or the other. The other basic features and specifications about this watch that we can cover quickly, it's a 316L stainless steel case. It does have a Seiko Hardlex crystal covering the dial. This is, of course, a 3-hand analog display with a date at the 3 o'clock position. We have a blue waffle dial with applied markers. Those markers, as well as the handset, which is a Seiko Monster style handset, are filled with Seiko's Lumibrite Loom. We do have a unidirectional 120 click bezel with aluminum insert and a stainless steel bracelet. The bracelet does have a dual button deployant clasp with a fold over safety latch. We'll touch on that more towards the end of this review. Usually on a watch, the highlight or the main point of interest is the dial, and while the dial on this watch is nice and the handset is good as well, really the piece de resistance of this watch is the case, and that's what we're going to talk about first. Now let's look at the profile of this case, and I don't know if anyone else thinks about it when they look at this watch, but when I look at this watch, I think of like Transformers. Like, I don't know, I feel like I'm looking at some sort of Decepticon, like it's going to turn into a little mini robot or something. I don't know, maybe that's just me being a child of the 80s and watching those old Japan-based cartoons about Transformers and the GoBots and all that stuff. But that's just what I think of when I see this. If we look at the other side with the crown guards, which have a kind of sharp sloping downward angle, it's even more accentuated to me. Now this case does have perforated lugs or lug holes, as you can see, so changing out the bracelets should be a snap. That's nice. And if we look at these lugs and the end links, which are solid end links by the way, there's a very hard downward slope here. You know, this is not my favorite style of Seiko dive watch in this affordable entry-level price range. I think that it's just a little bit too extreme. And while I wouldn't fault anyone that does like it because it is a really high-quality watch, especially at the price point, you know, again, it's not my favorite. When we talk about the other kind of kings of the Seiko entry level, we got the Skx, we have the Turtle, we have even the Sumo, which I've reviewed all of those in the past. We also have the Seiko 5, which is a super affordable alternative that comes in at like $150. It's the SNZF17, and I think there's a 1.5 model as well. All of those watches kind of appeal to me more, and we're not even touching on all of the quartz divers and the solar quartz divers that Seiko offers right now. Of all of them in the collection, yeah, this one just, because of the case shape, does appeal to me a little bit less. But there are some things that it does better than all of them. Most of them don't have perforated lug holes, and I really, really like the bezel on this. We'll talk about the bezel shortly. I'm going to come in really close here and show you the finishing on the case. The finishing is done really well. Now, while I did mention that it has all these sharp, harsh angles on the case, they're not sharp, though, as if, you know, to snag or cut or anything. They're all kind of a little soft on the very edge. They're kind of dehorned, is what I call it. It's just that the angles are very abrupt and sort of abrasive in their presentation or styling. Now, that said, we're talking about the finish, and the brushed, this entire case is pretty much all brushed finish. There's a few little highlights of polishing, as you can see under the end links. And on the very side of the case, inset here, between the sort of protruding lugs, you have a little bit of polishing here. The quality of the polishing there is not outstanding, but it is noticeable. You know, it's not a problem. On the other side of the case, on the right-hand flank, basically the same finishing. It sort of almost appears like these downward slopes might have a slight polish to them, or maybe they're just not brushed to the same extent as the rest of the watch. Nevertheless, though, the finishing, again, is excellent. The end links and the bracelet finishing, and this bracelet does have some wear. It's on loan from a viewer, who, again, thank you very much for sending it to me. I really do appreciate it. You know, again, it does have a little bit of wear, so the finishing doesn't match up perfectly, but as you can see, it's basically the same straight grain brushed finishing all throughout the case and the bracelet. We'll talk about the crown here, and you can see these crown guards that protrude out of the case, and again I illustrated that they do have this kind of aggressive downward slope on them, surrounds this somewhat oversized crown. I'll zoom in a little bit closer here to give you a look at the crown. The crown is done very, very well. This crown is done really well. It's a little oversized, and the knurling or texturing on it makes getting a purchase and manipulating it super easy. The very end of it kind of has I guess it's a polished finish, although it's not super, super high polished, but nevertheless, manipulating the crown, no problems at all. It unscrews, the threading on it is excellent. Unscrewing it out to the first position, of course, gives us hand wind as we would expect on a 4R series movement, and the action of hand winding it is great. Pulling the crown out to the first position, of course, sets the time, and pulling it out to the second position hacks the movement, as you can see here. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Pulling it out to the first position obviously sets the date. Pulling it out to the second position hacks the movement and lets you set the time. You guys know what I meant. Pushing down with a little pressure and winding the crown screws it back in perfectly. Very, very nice, and again, very easy to manipulate. A lot of the more affordable Seiko watches have issues with the threading of their crown and reseating it and screwing it out for that matter. This one does not suffer from that. I don't know if it's unique to just this example or the line as a whole, but I'm really happy with that. The bezel on this watch is done really well. Now this is a blue bezel predominantly with a little bit of a gray highlight up here at the 0 to 15 marks. Fully graduated bezel, of course it would be because this is an ISO certified dive watch. And part of those ISO certification requirements are to have a fully graduated bezel. Now the bezel itself, again, this is probably my favorite part of the watch. Not so much the style, although the aesthetic of it is quite nice, but the construction of it. We have a simple aluminum insert, which is nothing super special, but if we look at the edge of the bezel, or the sides, the profile, we have that same sort of knurling or texturing that you find on the crown, although sized a little bit differently, and a nice upward slope here so that the crystal sets ever so slightly recessed into the watch face. It's going to help protect that Hardlex crystal, which is a good thing. Manipulating it is very, very nice. You can see here that there's sort of like a cutout, so you can get a nice purchase there, as well as on this side of the case. It overhangs the case ever so slightly. And rotating it, the action is fantastic. It's not too tight, it's not too loose. It just works great. It does not line up 100% perfectly. If I click it right there, you can see it's off. This is, of course, a very common quality control issue with Seiko watches in general. Just off a little bit, maybe to the right, to my eyes. I don't know, it could be my eyes. It's very, very close, but super common to have slightly misaligned bezels. It is what it is, I guess. But yeah, using the bezel, manipulating it, the quality of the knurling on the edge of the bezel, not a standard coin edge bezel. I'll kind of come in here close and give you a nice good look at that texturing. It's really well done, and probably one of my favorite bezels on all of the more affordable Seiko dive watches. We did, of course, mention this is a Hardlex crystal, which sits ever so slightly recessed below the bezel. There's no chamfered edge like you might find in a Seiko Skx. It's pretty straightforward. Below the crystal, lost my train of thought there for a second, we have a really nicely executed dial, handset, all of the markers and everything. I'll zoom in here slightly closer so we can get a nice up-close look at that. Seiko does really nice dials at pretty much all of their price points, and this one's no exception. It's a dark blue dial with an interesting waffle pattern, kind of reminiscent of a royal oak. I've reviewed a really nice royal oak in the past. If you haven't watched that video, and a lot of you guys haven't because it doesn't have that many views, surprisingly, the royal oak calls that a tapissiere dial, and this one looks somewhat like that. I sort of crudely referred to that dial as a waffle pattern, which is certainly not the correct way to call a watch of that caliber's dial design. In this case for the Seiko, yeah, we could probably call that a waffle pattern and not be too offensive to the brand, but it is a nice dial. I do like it. The printing on the dial is done really well. You would think it would be difficult to get that Seiko branding, the Prospex logo, Automatic Divers 200, printed on a dial like this, but somehow they execute it really, really well. The dial does feature applied Lumibrite filled markers, and at the 6 and 9, somewhat of a different shape, a little trapezoid shape, and then a double sort of trapezoid up at the 12 o'clock side. It's very good. The Loom, of course, is Lumibrite, like I mentioned, and as you would expect, it's outstanding. Obviously, I'm going to roll in a little bit of video illustrating how that Loom looks. It's great. It's what you would expect. At this point, everybody knows that Seiko makes some of the best Loom. This one's no exception. The 3 o'clock position on the dial does have a date complication, since this is the 4R35 movement, which is a date-only version of the 4R series of movements. We get a date at the 3 o'clock. There is a somewhat truncated applied marker to the right of that date window. I like that. It helps keep your orientation and tell the time in the dark a little bit better. We do have a monster-style handset with that large, broad arrowhead hour hand and a fairly straightforward minute hand. The second hand is tipped in a white, long, needle-like arrow, and there's a little bit of loom filled in there as well. Overall, the handset's great. Everybody that likes the monster handset will love the handset on this watch. It's legible, works well, it looks nice. There's nothing to complain about there whatsoever. On the back of the case, we do have a very typical Seiko screw-down case back. In the center, we have a recessed portion with the somewhat embossed Tsunami Wave logo that's common amongst the Seiko divers. Nothing outstanding or different here than most of them. I just wanted to give you a quick look at it. It looks nice, it's functional, nothing to really say. We'll talk about the bracelet real quick. It's a typical Seiko bracelet, and forgive me because I didn't resize it. I don't know 100% if these are standard friction pins or if it's the pin and collar system that is somewhat hated by the watch collector community because it's difficult to resize. If I had to guess, I would think that these are pin and collars because most of the Seiko dive watches up in this mid-range use that. That said, it is a nice bracelet. It's a little bit rigid. If we look at it here, not a ton of flex. If you set it down, it won't lay flat, as you can see, because of the way that this bracelet is constructed. So if you want to, set it on your table, it kind of wobbles and teeter-totters. That said, it's a comfortable bracelet. It's definitely durable. Probably the only downside about the bracelet itself is going to be the clasp, and that's, a normal sort of complaint for Seiko dive watches or Seiko watches in general at this affordable price point. It does have a fold-over safety latch, and it does have dual button deployment, but once you fold it over and you look at the swing arm, you can see it's this cheap stamped stainless steel, and the clasp itself is also just a low-quality stamped clasp. It does have 4 micro adjustment holes, which is a plus. I love having micro adjustment holes on my watches. It does also have a diver's extension here over at this side, and it's a little lever that you fold open. Forgive me, I'm not going to illustrate it. It really almost pulls my fingernails out to get under there and actually deploy that diver's extension, but you fold that down and then it opens up and gives you an extra, a couple of centimeters. If you were diving, you could put it over a wetsuit. The clasp is obviously going to be a scratch magnet, as you can probably see here on this example. All stainless steel watches that use a clasp are going to have problems with that. There are some slight polished edges and the sides of the clasp, and the sides of all of the bracelet links are polished as well. It's okay, it's not super high quality polishing, but it's typical, it's what they normally do. So how does this watch compare to some of the other examples in the Seiko catalog? Well, let's bring in some. Here we have a Seiko Turtle. The reference number escapes me, so forgive me, I don't know it off the top of my head, but we have side by side the Samurai and the Turtle. And how do they compare? Well, visually they're strikingly different, obviously. The Turtle has that very curvaceous pillow-style case, which gives it its namesake, and we have this very hard angular case on the Samurai. The Turtle presents a little bit bigger, although it's really not much bigger in actual physical dimensions. But on the wrist, it feels a little bit bigger, it looks a little bit bigger, that's my impression. Some people are going to like the Turtle, and it's a bit more affordable. Some people are going to like the Samurai. I can't really split hairs here. They're both excellent. It's going to come down to style preference. It's going to just boil down to what you like personally. Next, we have the ever-popular Seiko Skx. This is the 007, another excellent Seiko dive watch. It's very much an entry-level diver. It doesn't have the really nice applied markers that the Samurai has on the dial. The case is quite a bit smaller. It presents smaller. It wears smaller. But it is a great watch. Which would you pick of these two? Well, if you're looking to save a bunch of money, the Skx is kind of the super value of the bunch, but it is not quite as full-featured as the Samurai. You don't get hand winding and hacking on the Skx. It has probably a slightly lower quality bracelet. Well, not slightly. A lot of people hate this Jubilee bracelet that the Skx comes on. I sort of like it. I don't really consider it a super low quality bracelet though. I think it's actually a pretty good bracelet. Yeah, it's jingly and jangly and loose, but I really enjoy that bracelet. Nevertheless, the Samurai bracelet is certainly a higher quality bracelet, although the clasps are basically the same. So yeah, I just wanted to set these two side by side and give you a look at maybe what the Samurai looks like next to an Skx. Here we have the Seiko 5 Sea Urchin SNZF17, I believe. I forget if this Seiko 5 is the 15 or the 17. But regardless, I just wanted to show you the super high value affordable Seiko 5 diver. This is of course only a 100 meter diver. It's not an ISO certified dive watch. It's more a diver in style than actual function. but it's a great value and it is a really cool watch. I haven't reviewed this watch yet, but I will in the near future, so keep an eye out for that. If you want to save a bundle of money, this is an excellent option. Sitting side by side with the Samurai, size-wise, they don't look too particularly different. The Seiko 5 is a bit smaller, and it's lacking a lot of features like a screw-down crown, like a hand-winding and hacking movement, but this Seiko 5 does have a really nice dial with applied markers. It's got a very functional bezel. It's got the same great Seiko Lumibright luminescence. It does include a day and date complication as opposed to just the date, so that might be a plus for some people. Anyway, I just wanted to set this one side by side and give you guys a look at it. So that's the Seiko Samurai, reference number SRPB49J1 in this case. It's a great watch. Stylistically, it's not my favorite thing in the world, but I can appreciate that it is very high quality and a very well executed watch. I'm sure a lot of people really love it. Certainly there's things about it that I love as well, but that case shape is just a little too funky, a little too extreme for me, and it's probably not something that I would wear on a daily basis. We'll go ahead and jump back over to the studio view and I'll close this review out with some final thoughts, so stick with me for a few more minutes, guys. So what are my closing thoughts on the Seiko Samurai SRPB49? Well, of course, this is the J1 or the Japanese version, and there is a K version. Very, very minor differences, basically printing on the dial, maybe technically where it's made. I don't think if you were searching for one of these watches that it would really matter much if you got the J versus the K version. I say that because in my experience, there's really no difference between the two versions. And I pull that experience from a review I did comparing the Skx 009 J versus K. If you haven't seen that video, go back and check it out. When we're talking about which is better, the made in Japan version or the K version, which is arguably made in Malaysia or some other Southeast Asian country, I think that, yeah, you're going to see differences from time to time. But that's just inconsistencies in production. That's just differences in when the watches were made. I don't think that it has anything to do with where it's made. I don't think one is higher quality than the other. I've had people tell me that they have J and K versions of the Skx, and their K version is better than their J version. Vice versa. People have said the opposite. Their J versions that they've had time with are better than the K versions. So if we're looking for a Samurai, again, I wouldn't necessarily target the J version. It just happens to be what I have here on loan today. And I wanted to put my 2 cents in on that debate here real quick in the final thoughts before we talk about anything else. So while this is the SRPB49 Samurai, which has a dark blue dial and a blue and gray bezel, there are a number of variations on the market. You know, pick the one that you like the best. It's really just aesthetic differences. Functionally, they're the exact same. That said, I think this is one of my favorites that I've seen in the catalog. There's a Patty version that's got the red and blue kind of Pepsi theme. That's cool as well. And then there's a more black with a little bit of gray highlighting on the bezel. That one's also cool too. But, I mean, the blue looks great. Which one you pick, you know, it's up to your personal tastes. Now, once you've decided which one you like, should you get it? What is my opinion there? Would I pick this over an Skx, which is more affordable, or a Turtle, which is pretty similar in quality, or maybe something even a little bit higher? Well, that's really going to come down to whether or not you like the aesthetics, the styling, particularly of the case. The dial is typically the highlight for most watches, but in this case, I think that the watch's case is the highlight of the watches. It's very interesting, it's very distinct, it's very different. It's got all of those hard angled lines and edges. It's not a curvaceous pillowed case style that you might be more accustomed to with the Skx and with the Turtle. It's not my favorite aesthetic. It's not my favorite style, if I'm being honest. I do like the watch. I do think that it wears really well. It's certainly very good quality. It's right in line with everything else in the Seiko mid-tier that, you know, I've spent a lot of time with. But stylistically, I don't think that it's for me. I'm not going to tell anybody else what they should or shouldn't enjoy. That's, you know, up to personal taste. It's completely subjective. So yeah, if you decide you like this, pick out one that you like, go with it. I think you'll be happy with it. But yeah, make sure that this is, you know, the style for you. It's a little bit funky, it's a little bit different, and hopefully my video illustrated that enough so that you can make an informed decision for yourself. Other than the style, there's not really a whole lot to dislike about this watch. It's executed really well. I think the bezel is one of the better, more affordable Seiko bezels. And yeah, again, I do think it's a great watch. It's high quality. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it with that. I'm going to give this a 2 thumbs up, but kind of hesitant about the styling. But again, that's just subjective. That's just me. It's probably not something that I would want to wear on a daily basis. Alright guys, thanks for checking out this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, give me a thumbs up, and if you're not a subscriber of the channel, please do consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate that. Don't forget, down in the description there's going to be some links. Number 1, there's a link to the Horology 101 Facebook group. If you're not a member of that already, go ahead and join so that you can be eligible for the giveaway that I'll be doing in the next week or so. Number 2, links to Amazon. You can support the channel by clicking on my Amazon affiliate link before you do any shopping on Amazon. If you like the watch that I've reviewed here, if you liked anything else that I've reviewed in the past, go ahead and click that link. It'll take you over to Amazon, and I get a small commission if you decide to purchase something. That would help me out quite a bit. If you want to support me on Patreon, I'd appreciate that. You can also find links to that down below. And of course, follow me on social media, my Facebook page, Twitter, and Instagram. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be back next week with another review, and I'll be announcing that giveaway shortly. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye now.